Oh. So, 49 years ago, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles after winning the California primary by Sirhan. We know that story and we all are familiar with it to some extent. Now, what I thought was really interesting was how it seems that out of every politician that has ever lived, that has not been president, he gets the most biographies or books written about him. I have no information that could support this, but I could certainly think of a number of novels that are just directly about him as opposed to Humphrey or McCarthy or Keating that Manny ran against in his New York Senate race. But I was so just without anything to say when I woke up this morning because I had been thinking about the assassination, his life, and everything relating to him in the days leading up to now. And just really, what is it that he should be remembered for? And what always bothers me when I get to talking about him with anyone who is also a fan or a supporter or favorable in their view of him is that we get into this what if territory. If he and it's not necessarily bad to think about what could have been, um, aside from the fact that it never will be. But it's this idea that they always will resort to speaking about the different issues for which they believe he would have been better than Nixon in the presidency on if he had won. Which there's even people who could tell you that he might not have even got the nomination given the way the electoral process was rigged at that time. So you get into this stuff where they talk about him ending the Vietnam War faster, which I think would have happened. Um, they start talking about instead of a war on drugs, there'd be treatment for drugs, which I'm inclined to believe as well, even though I don't remember him during his campaign making mention of treating individuals with drugs. Of course, I know that given the Kennedy's family's history with mental illness, I'm sure he would have been more sympathetic with his own background, with Rosemary and all that. So you start getting into the. I wish I could read all these articles in front of you, the viewer, because they almost entirely have the same narrative of if he had lived, you know, this would have been better and this would have been better, and there's never an acknowledgement of where there could have been some bad. Maybe the 1972 trip to China with Nixon, if he does it, it's not as well. Maybe he's not as good on the economy. Yes, I believe he would have been the best choice out of all of the 1968 candidates. And certainly, I think would have been easier in helping to heal racial divisions. But we can't get into this territory where we make somebody out to be something that they were not, which is perfect. And he wasn't that. And I think a number of his biographers and admirers would know that. But nonetheless, we can't always just focus on what was good. We have to also look at what could be lost in that hypothetical of him winning or living to see November of that year. So that's always the part that bothers me about remembering him and talking about his legacy or how he should be remembered. I typically, in thinking about him, think about what he did, such as on this mindless menace of violence, that speech, the one on the assassination of MLK, obviously the Day of Affirmation address, you know, the University of Kansas speech. There's a whole bunch of them, and I really can get and actually identify with most of his rhetoric in those addresses because there's something that happened and that I know another person felt the way I did at that time by the proof of either hearing him speak about that or getting a transcript and reading it. And it's so much better than the hypotheticals because it's actually in front of me. I can see it, and I know it existed. Those speeches and the words within them. So, all in all, it always bothers me to think about this day as well because I get into this idea that he could have lived longer than probably. I mean, I know if JFK were had not been killed, I'm very very confident he would have died before this year in his 100th birthday. But with RFK, he had, and that, again, that's based off of JFK's now known health illnesses and his different issues that he had. But RFK had wonderful health. He had vigor, and it doesn't appear to me that he would just randomly develop some disease that we're not used to or already now familiar with in these last few decades since he's passed away. But I do admit that there still could have been something that snuck up on him, like the thing with Ted, where if you ask somebody in 2006, do you think Ted Kennedy is going to be dead in 3 years? I doubt they would have said yes. And him getting that illness. So it's still bothersome to me that a person who had nothing wrong with them is in the ground. And that's always the issue I have where individuals who lose their lives to gun violence, because these aren't people who are terminally ill, and nobody decided to make that their last day than the person who shot them. And it's so disturbing that we live in this society to where people will claim you're infringing upon their rights if you support gun control, just as people who support gun control will make it seem as if, oh, if we just do this, it can help against, the this and that. And then, I'm living in California where we've had more of it passed than probably anywhere else. And we still had San Bernardino. We still have these different incidents at these schools, obviously, these communities, South LA, all just different areas around. I think Oakland to some extent too have these issues with the people in them. Obviously not all of them, but the gun violence that plagued his era is even worse now. To the point where it's not just going after famous people; it's going after individuals who are just normal, like you and presumably like me and presumably like the person who's watching this. And that really should be another reason why we think of the assassination. We have to prevent the killing of people who seek office. When Trump was able to get away from that British guy, even though I disagree with his policies, I was happy that happened, because nobody's life is worth taking over a viewpoint, no matter how much it contrasts from yours. We can call each other idiots and dummies and retards and morons all day long, but we should never get to the point where we feel that to stop this person from getting in the office or to prevent this person from doing this, we have to use violence. It's never okay, and that's what this day should be about. That's what his death should be about, and his legacy should be about working together, thinking about how the world is going to be in several decades from now, what you want your kids to see, how you want them to live, and just being a person who can be admirable for choosing to use their words and their reasoning instead of their fist and their kicks.